Now, we have 1,001 plugins on our computers, digital audio workstations to simulate old technology. You can buy Abbey Road plugins, for example, which have got the record crackle and various other things, tape simulators, Audio Thing, also make a range of fantastic processors that just take you back a bit. Why would we do this? Why on earth, when you spend all of that money on mics, preamps, pristine monitors, noiseless, this, that and the other, would you do such a thing to your recordings? Well, it depends. Now, I've got a few albums that I'm going to talk about in the context of recording and the sound generally. Now, the first one I've got is this. It's Fat Swallow's Ain't Misbehavin' compilation. Now, this is a compilation of quite a few pieces of music that he recorded in really the 1930s. He died in 1943. So this was years before cassettes or really open reel tape and vinyl. Now, bizarrely, the CD release of the Fat Swallow Ain't Misbehavin' album has, or it did have anyway, it had Fat Swallow in digital stereo. I mean, that's just very bizarre. It's just trying to flog a CD, digital stereo format. But stereo didn't exist either when he made his recordings. They were all recorded on 10-inch shellac, which gramophone records, turning at 78 revs per minute, and with a fairly poor frequency response. So really the CD revealed completely the limitations of the source material. Now, my dad had this when we were kids. This is the Django Reinhardt Stefan Grappelli compilation on the Ace of Clubs, the Decca label. Now, every single recording on there was made prior to 1946. So, it's mono. It's recorded again on shellac. Now, an example of these two things, if I was going to record, I've done a few gypsy jazz recordings, which you can see on my channel, on my Tune a Day during self-isolation during the coronavirus pandemic. Now, with this, I tried to make the sound as faithful as I could to the original recordings. Why would I do that? Why don't I just record it pristine and this is gypsy jazz in 2020, not 1940? Well, I think the technology really defined that genre in quite a number of ways. And sure, if I want to make it sound like somebody sat in a cafe or bar in Montmartre listening to a live gypsy jazz band, then that's fine. But actually, every single Django Reinhardt recording until the very end when he moved to tape really has that sound, and that's something that I really like to emulate, and that's where the plugins come in. Sometimes you can sort of fudge it by using an EQ and taking the top end off, or you can actually get a record plugin and actually do that itself. You can buy cassette plugins. Now, the other album that I had growing up, really these two were the main ones, had this. Dance Craze. Now, it's a 1981 compilation from the film of the same name, involving bands like the Specials, Selector, Madness, that sort of thing. Now, when I listened to this record release, which I found recently, we used to have it on cassette. And then when you listen to the record, you realise how much better the record was than the cassette. It's fantastic. It was so good to have that recording. Now, I've heard it on CD as well, and yes, it's even better. But that was made in 1981. It was still analog equipment. So there's going to be little bits and pieces, little bits of noise, and that sort of thing. But really, we spent most of the 1970s and 80s as recording engineers. This was before my time. I was growing up in the 1980s. But recording engineers of that time would spend ages trying to get the best sound they possibly could from that equipment. That art is being lost a little because it's easy to just press go on your computer with a half-decent mic and sound card and not really think about it. Now, the last album I'm going to show you is this. This is Donald Fagen's Nightfly album of 1982. Donald Fagen was a founder member of Steely Dan, and really this album really sounds quite a lot like those sort of Steely Dan albums of the late 70s, except it sort of shows his personality a little differently perhaps. But this album was recorded using fully digital recording, those 3M 32-track recorders. When I was working for EMI in the 1990s, I remember we used to have a Mitsubishi 32-track recorder, very old, similar age to the 3M machines. And it was fantastic, a brave new world in recording. Suddenly you could record everything as the data onto a machine rather than on an analog tape head. So why then would you put a digital recording back on one of these? Well, this was 1982. This was the year before the CD became fully available. And in fact, this album had to wait until 1984 before a CD release. But we all bought it on this. At the time, it was released on a couple of other formats which were digital, but they were extremely expensive. Nobody had them. Everyone had a turntable, of course. We all had record players and tape decks. So you'd buy this and you put it on your turntable and marvel at the album's recording quality. However, you were still listening to an analog. You were listening to a needle being dragged through a piece of plastic, which is what this is. So, sort of rather makes a mockery of going through that whole process of recording things really carefully with a digital format, and then you stick it back on a piece of plastic. But I've grown up with this album, and I know where all the pops and cracks happen. You know, it's average condition record. You can do these things now, and I think it's really important that we have these plugins because people of a certain age, myself included, really remember life before CDs. We remember life before digital technology with fondness. That's why all these plugins are available. You can relive those times. But also with the genres in mind. If I was going to record, going back to the Fat Swallow album, if I was going to record somebody on stride piano, I would probably record it in mono at the very least before then. You know, making a sort of, putting it through a plug-in to make it sound a bit crackly and old. But I would certainly go as far as recording in mono before, you know, putting any other plugins on, because that's the way it was recorded originally. Those brave new world sort of years of the sort of 20s and 30s when all of these records were released of these artists, it really did define those genres. It defined the way we grew up with music. And I think it's important never to lose sight of that. So get yourself a plugin or two and just see what that does to your stereo mix.